on the main input, and it also tiles just the same amount, so these overlap each other quite nice. And I can also grab the normal map back in the main output, and you see how they all just tile perfectly. Each one works great. And there's the color map again. And I export each of these out, and we have tileable versions of all of those materials. All right, so now that we made a tileable version of the color map, the height map, and the normal map, now we need to think about the other maps we need for physical-based rendering, PBR materials, and that is a roughness and a reflection map. And when I'm creating them for photogrammetry, there's a little bit of voodoo, a little bit of magic to kind of get the right amount of right amount of image to make it work. There's no science to it. It just has to look right when you're tweaking it in your engine or when you're tweaking it in Marmoset. And what I'm doing here is I'm creating those mineral deposit little highlight glints that I didn't have in the scan, but I want in the reflection map and in the glossy map or roughness map to give a little interest, a little mineral deposit interest to the surface to make it a little more cool. And there's multiple ways to isolate those highlights. In this case, I'm creating a very high contrast version of the color map, and being able to use that as an alpha channel to control how much highlights I want from that glint mineral deposit map. So in this case, now that I found a good contrast ratio for that selection, I'm going to create that alpha map that I'm going to use as a mask to negate all of the highlights. And as I adjust the levels on that mask, I can control how strong those highlights are. So going to the next step, what I want to do is consolidate all those different maps. In this case, the ambient occlusion, the roughness map, and the reflection map into one single image using RGB channels for each of those. So this is the combined version with all of them combined. So it looks wrong, but once I bring them to Unreal, I can separate those channels and use them separately for each of the different control maps. And what's great about this, it saves memory. And here is the ambient occlusion map that I created using bitmap material, just from the height map in the red channel. And in the green channel, I have the roughness map or gloss map. Sorry, gloss map is the same thing as a roughness map in V-Ray, so I often confuse the two, but this is gloss, roughness, relatively the same one I created in Photoshop before with all those glints. The more white it is, the more shiny it is, and the darker it is, the more rough it is. And then here is the reflection map. That just dictates how much is reflecting. The more white it is, the more reflective it is, and the darker it is, the less reflective it is. And once I get into Unreal or Marmoset, I tweak these texture maps to get the right result. All right, so now we're in Marmoset where I'm look-deving these tileable materials. You can see there I have a tessellated plane or a tessellated half sphere that is pretty high res, and I up that value just to get an accurate displacement representation of how it's looking. And I also got some bells and whistles like that the field turn on just to make it look a little more cool. And what I'm doing here, I'm just really trying to find the right values for the roughness map and the reflectance map. The other maps are pretty standard. I don't adjust the height map too much. Here I'm just adjusting the strength of that height map, but I'm keeping the value of the base map the same. And I'm just turning off and on to see how they all build up. in the final shader. And when they're all on, it's a pretty convincing result, and this all tilables, and the tessellation value dictates how much resolution is in the displacement. And I'm going to be using displacement on Unreal. It's very expensive, but again, to focus on the look and start high and go down low is a very good approach, because you always want to, again, start as high as you can and then work down to your base requirements. And I'm just going to go through a few of the other materials I made. This is a sand, very basic one. Kind of see the subtle displacement on there. There's a few areas where I end up fixing the tileable nature, because there's a few, like there's like a line visible in a few spots that I'll need to tweak. And this one I want to keep very subtle on displacement once it's in Unreal, because it's supposed to complement and contrast the more noisy, rocky texture that I had before. And here's another rock material that I didn't use in Unreal, but I use in Painter to get the sculpted rock that I'm going to show a little later. Use that as a tileable version in Painter. So having these tileable sets of textures and materials that work out in Marmoset can also work out in Painter, but also in Unreal. So having these sets are really, really great. And here's just one more busy one that I used in Painter. By the time I got into Painter, I ended up only using one of them. It's a bit of an overkill, but again, having these libraries of tileable options just increase your ability to have options down the road. And here's one that I ended up not using, but I'm going to be using in future projects, which is a forest ground material. I was thinking about the idea that maybe this orb device that I have in the final scene was causing some life to grow, or some kind of other supernatural, whimsical event to happen. And I was thinking it'd be nice to have like a ground material that was not sand or rock or a desert material, but was more of a forest ground material. So I did not use this one, but I'm going to be using it in future projects, and I was pretty happy with how the result turned out, using the same techniques that I showed before. And I'm just going to go over quickly how I made the mountains in the Unreal scene using World Machine and the plugin Geoglyph, which I feel gives a more natural output and more natural generators that work pretty all right. They kind of deviate from the World Machine look that a lot of people can pick up on. And I just started with one of the prefab settings and tweaked them how I wanted to, and ended up creating a 1-to-1 color map, a 1-to-1 normal map, and a 1-to-1 height map from the one of the default project files. And I did that because I don't want to control the individual sand height, the individual rock height, or any of those extra details. I just kind of want a very simple set of textures to create a simple mountain kit that I can use and place in Unreal. And in this situation, I wanted to create a very flat plane with some valleys and dips that I can rotate around, and just like all the other assets, just kind of configure and kit bash together to get a terrain out in the very distance. So once I'm happy with what I have in World Machine, I'll export those out to ZBrush and create a displaced version of the geometry using the height map from World Machine, decimate that, and then bake those down in Marmoset. And here we're seeing that hero mountain that was made. And again, there's no tileable textures on top of this. It's just a one-to-one color map, one-to-one normal map, and I used the height map to create it, but now I'm not using that. So pretty much all this is just a color map and a normal map. And when I am able to rotate this around, it's really convincing that I can create a whole landscape. So now I'm going to talk about how I create the rocks that I sculpt in ZBrush, because using photogrammetry assets is fantastic, but sometimes you need a specific kind of rock. In this case, one that I wanted, like a sheared, very sharp, layered rock that I couldn't find when I was doing the photogrammetry trip, so I ended up sculpting it. But then I could use photogrammetry scanned materials and those tileable textures in that rock, on that rock, using Substance Painter. So this is that rock in Marmoset, the final result, and I'm just going to break down here on how that was sculpted. So the origin of this rock came from a personal project I did back in October 2016, this whimsical Cape Bear scene, and I used displacement and V-Ray to originally create that rock, but how I started the base on that, I didn't record at the time, but this was the original base that I used, and I'm just kind of simulating my process of using just a few brushes, mostly the standard, the crackle brush here, that gives a nice like shearing effect and creates a organic base. And then I'll go through with the clay 2 brush and the trim dynamic brush, and that just helps create some sharp edges. And I'm using Dynamesh here, so once I get a shape I like, I'll Dynamesh and then continue on. So I'm just going to give a quick little demo on how that was created. The high-res was created from these low-res blocks. And I also made a custom brush similar to the Dam standard brush to create some cracks, and I made this a while back, many years ago, and it works pretty well just for getting a cracky, splintery effect that can work on rocks, but also wood or other kind of surfaces. So that's a small chunk of how I would approach that, and this is the final one that I made for that bear cave scene. and it's pretty okay. I think I would redo it again if I had to, but what I'm going to go over is how I simulated the displacement effect that I had in V-Ray, but used the noise function in ZBrush to get that next level, really high fidelity, crackly layered effect that I had going on in V-Ray. So, but the thing is, when you use noise in ZBrush default, it tends to inflate the edges, and you end up with like this squishy end result that just doesn't work very well. So there's a technique that I found from Nick Sawyer on Polycount, and check out his ArtStation, it's pretty cool. But it's a clever technique that minimizes that inflation effect that we saw earlier. And what you do is, like I saw in the screenshot there, is you take a morph target of the low res of the subdivision 0, and you subdivide that asset quite a bit. And once you apply the noise at the highest subdivision, you can go back to the lowest subdivision and then do that difference. And it preserves, once you go back to the high res, it preserves a lot of the hard edges. And it's a really clever technique of using noise without all that inflation that you get before. And I think going forward, it's a great way of keeping those hard, crisp edges. And I feel this looks not as high fidelity as the V-Ray displaced version, but still pretty good. And I'm going to use this high-res version to bake down to a decimated low-res version with a cleaner UV layout. All right, so now I'm going to go over some techniques that I use in Substance Painter. One of the assets is this orb mech sphere that I made originally in 3ds Max and rendered in V-Ray before. This was all procedural generated techniques before. And here's that same rock that we sculpted in ZBrush before. And starting with that rock, I'm going to start with the Unreal setting there in the new project window. And you want to start with the low-res version of that. And quickly, I just want to go over the organization I use. I keep a folder of high, low, and I put all the bake maps in one folder. And that just helps me keep things consistent. And I've been using this kind of folder process for a while for when I'm doing high-res, low-res bakes. And there is all the different folders. And there's the low res of that slate rock that I have already loaded up in the scene. And now that I have that ready to go, here's this low res version that has been decimated but has a UV shell. It could be packed better, but I just kind of keep it the way it was from UV Master from ZBrush. This could definitely have been packed better, but for the purpose of this demo, it's okay. And then I'm going to bake the textures down from the high res. So I already have the high res loaded there that I sculpted from ZBrush. I just exported out at the highest subdivision. And I really don't need thickness map, but all the other maps are necessary for using smart materials, which I'll be using exclusively on this. This is not an extensive demo into Painter. Honestly, I'm still learning Painter, and I'm not as versed as other software, but using the smart mask and smart materials are a huge win, and they just make things much more fast. So here we have the high res baked down to that low res. We have the normal map, the world space map, the ID map, which there's no need for that, and the ambient occlusion map, curvature, and position, and thickness. So with those applied, I'm just shuffling through the different maps to see how they look individually. They can be used in a smart material. And what I'm using is a smart material that I made in Substance Designer. But all I'm really doing in there is feeding it the tileable outputs that I made in bitmap material. And that just is an easy package. It allows me to have the color map, the normal map, the height map, and the roughness map, and the reflection map all into one nice little package. So what I'm doing there is just adjusting the scale of the UVs, getting the right feel, And that's just a smart material that was made with photogrammetry tilables that is not very smart, but it does the job. It serves the purpose for what I need. And you kind of see I experimented with two different tilables, one that was more busy and one that was more clean, and I ended up just using one, and that's the busy one, because it ended up not being that busy when I toned everything down. And I'm not using the normal map, I'm just using the height map for this asset because I felt like it was a little too busy, and the baked down normal map that I had from the high res did the job. I didn't need the supplemental normal map from that photogrammetry captured tileable. And then the next map that I have on is one of the smart materials built in to Painter, and that's just the dirt map. And it helps a lot. It kind of gives all nice buildup of dirt in the crevices, and it's controllable in the map option there. And I ended up just not using the height map on this one or the normal that much. I just wanted a little bit of darkness in the crevices that only apply to the color maps. You can see how you can adjust the various settings to get a result that works pretty well. And I feel like the default materials that come with Painter are so good, and you can always integrate your own if you make them in Substance Designer. But for me, a lot of the stuff I've been doing so far, I don't need to create new materials. I just use what's in there as a base. Now jumping to the sphere that I made before, this mechanical sphere, you can see the UVs are really messy. This was not, if this was a proper hard surface model, the UVs would be much more clean, but I just took what I had and retopologized it quickly using Z-Remesher and then UV Master on that. And I start with a base metal. This is simulating what I did with my shader in V-Ray. Start with a base metal and then build up the various layers on top of that. In this case, the paint layer is another one, and I used a smart mask to mask out all the edge wear on that. And you can see I could change the colors. And I'm just trying to simulate what I had for V-Ray. That's why it's nice to have a high-res V-Ray bar to always look to, because you know that it was mostly physically motivated, physically accurate in many ways, and I can use that as a reference point to try to match when it gets into game. And here I'm just turning off some of the bells and whistles in the display, like the vignette and all this stuff. It's more just to help presentation. It doesn't really help you when you're making the settings and the various maps and masks, but it makes it look a little cooler. And I'm adjusting the amount of the scale on the wear on that. And again, that's just using a smart mask on that. And then I painted, I did have a ID map on the little glowy bits on this, but I just painted them quickly by hand, and those are emissive. That'll be emissive once it gets on Real. And then the final step was creating this this machinery smart material, and I kind of tweaked it a bit to make it more like oil stains on it, and it worked out great. It kind of simulated what I had in V-Ray, and I'm pretty happy with the results. Kind of nice build up around all the edges, and I'm testing out to see how everything's reflecting. But you can see, even in a matter of like 10 minutes, I was able to get a really decent result using just the smart materials and smart masks. And once I export these out, they'll carry over into Unreal pretty seamlessly. All right, so now that we have all our assets created, I'm going to talk about the process of creating an asset gem. This is a screenshot of it on Real, but it all starts with assembling the assets and scaling them correctly in 3ds CU Max. So I have my mountains, just the two, the hero mountain over there and the more flat plain one. And I have some foliage here. I ended up not using these. These were just test examples. And there's the 3 tileable materials that I use. Ended up not using them, the rock ones in Unreal, but at least I had them ready to go if I needed to. And there's the cement asset that can be used to combine and integrate various forms. And I'm also using this batch export version plugin for 3ds CU Max that scales them correctly and brings them to the origin and exports them out as FBX. And it just helps with the process of getting all these assets out of 3ds Max and into Unreal. And again, these gems are really helpful just to get a sense of scale, how things are working, and then I'll bring them from 3ds Max and reassemble that gem in Unreal. So here we are now in Unreal, getting closer to assembling the final scene. This is with all of the materials tweaked and all the final. Basically, this scene is ready to go. All these assets are ready to be placed and integrate into a final scene. That's another rock that I captured, and the one that I used before as an example of cleaning up. And from this gem, it allows you to really balance and hone everything in before you start spreading and combining all these around. And it's called a gym because it's like going to a gym, right? You go to different stations, you see everything together, you can hop around and just see it all working together. And that's this sculpted rock we're looking at right now. And there is the mountains that carried over into Unreal. And I'm keeping everything very high res, so all these textures are 2 to 4K. Obviously, if this was a game engine or like a shipping product, that would have to go way down lower. But again, starting high and bringing down is always a good way to go. And here's I was experimenting with some ivy. This was made with ivy gen on top of that, and I ended up not using that. And here's some foliage created using SpeedTree. I use SpeedTree with Unreal because the wind settings carry over and the library is pretty extensive, and it's a really great way of just getting real-time foliage. For the offline rendering or the V-Ray rendering, I use the GrowFX for that, but for this situation, SpeedTree works out pretty great. And now we're just looking a little closer in on how that mech ball was transferred over from Substance Painter. And you can see the ground has displacement turned on, which is crazy expensive, but looks really cool. And in the future, I think we're going to be able to support more of this functionality as the engine and hardware gets better and faster. And the cool part is I can use blending techniques between them. This simulates how we blend materials at Naughty Dog, using just vertex blends to fade between different materials. And in this case, I have the drier sand on top of this more rocky, moist terrain. And I showed how I made both of those. Well, the more rocky one using the tileable version of photogrammetry. And it really helps when I balance all those textures out to blend and integrate the scene. You can kind of see how just painting that moist, more busy version of that ground kind of integrates those rocks immediately. And I'll be using that later in the scene as a final touch to bring everything together. And I'm going to go over the foliage placement tool here, which is, again, super simple, extremely powerful. I think going forward, how the industry is going, how things are moving, more procedural placement is going to replace this functionality. But still, when we try to create games that have specific looks and specific situations, being able to control the foliage or paint the foliage by hand has a certain benefit. And Unreal makes this very easy with the foliage placement tool. And I'm just adjusting the scale here to get different scale of the foliage. And I tend to start out bigger foliage. I'll place that by hand using the instance click mode. So I'm not painting swash of foliage. I'm just doing one at a time per click. And I'll start bigger And as I'm happy with those big forms, I'll slowly reduce the radius and just kind of taper that off. And that makes a more natural fading scale situation. I think that is pretty natural and pretty pleasing to the eye. And also you can erase them very easy by hitting Shift, and that allows you to erase all the foliage that you want. So it's a great way of populating foliage on a scene, especially grass and small elements, even trees or whatever you need to. In this case, I was experimenting with ferns. This is when I was going with the idea that maybe this mechanical orb device was going to be a source of growing nature or in this desert environment, but I ended up backing off that because it was just getting a little too busy, a little too mismatched of ideas. So I ended up keeping it a little more simple. But it's a powerful way of spreading foliage around. And here we're looking at the sculpted rock again. And this is basically how I assemble the scene. It's very simple in a way. There's no magic sauce to this, but all it is pretty much duplicating and arranging the rocks in various formations that collide and combine. It's similar to kit bashing techniques. And the key is finding a rock shape early on that can work in multiple positions or multiple directions. That just minimizes the amount of assets you're using, so you can see I'm trying to keep things as minimal asset count wise as possible. And here I'm showcasing the new feature in Unreal, a volumetric fog. You kind of see how the light builds up. We get some sweet God rays going on. And I'm also using real-time GI, which I'll go into a bit, just in a little bit here. But it's really cool because it gives all that indirect bounce real time without having to use light mass. And that's using the light propagation volumes, which I'll go in, again, like I said, in a little bit here. I'm also using a skylight, just simulating the ambient light from the sky. And there's the atmospheric fog with the volumetric light turned on. It's actually very similar to the V-Ray physical fog, where how it just kind of picks up light, bounces it around in the fog and atmosphere, and is a much more realistic effect going on. So I'm going to be using this in the scene. And once I get all these settings I like the fog, the light, even the post-process volumes, the settings how I want with the color correction, the tone mapper, and the various settings in the post-process volume. Once I'm happy with that, I'll use that as a starting point for a scene. I'm simulating my process with V-Ray here, where once I create materials, once I create lights that I like, I'll use that as a starting point so I don't need to reinvent the wheel over and over again. And that just saves time and allows me to jump in and create scenes that I'm pretty happy with. And that way you're not creating from scratch every single time. I find that kind of overwhelming. Oh, here we're seeing the real-time GI effect kicking on with the intensity. You want to keep that still pretty subtle. You don't want to go crazy with the intensity. I think keeping the default settings are not too bad. So now that we have the gym assembled, we're ready to go into lighting and materials. All right, so now I'm going to focus on Unreal materials and lighting. We went over briefly some of that before, but I'm going to focus on materials first. And I'm going to use this rock as a example of the most simple material in the scene. And by simple, I mean it just has the bare bones element going on to make it physically accurate. And that is a base color that I baked from Marmoset, a specular map that I created in Photoshop from before, and the roughness map that I created in Photoshop as well, and a normal map from Marmoset. So these are all very basic. They're all 4K, so pretty high. Again, going consistently trying to be a VizDev scene here, so these would be much lower res if it was a shipping product in current gen. So that's the most simple of an asset. And then going to the next step of this orb, it's a little more complex, but still relatively the same. The only thing going on here is I'm using the pack map that I showed before, so I'm combining all the various metallic roughness into one map, and I'm not using the ambient occlusion here. And you can see the color map went into the base color, and the green channel went into the roughness, and the blue channel went into metallic. And I exported this out of Substance Painter, and it created this map for me, so I don't have to combine those in Photoshop. And for the emissive texture, I'm multiplying the color on top of the mask of that a few times just to kind of get a nice glow, and also some nice light actually casting in the scene. Because it's a real-time GI, I'm getting some effect of that emissive material in the scene itself. So now we're back in the scene, and I'm going to talk just briefly about the foliage. I did not use this grass, but I just want to talk about how it's set up. It's using scattering and not just the base default textures from SpeedTree, but I'm tweaking them a bit to balance them out, because the default result out of SpeedTree was a little too saturated, a little too contrasty. And in reality, what I would do is I'd actually use my own grass texture if I wanted to, but in this case, I'm just using what came from SpeedTree. And actually SpeedTree created this material when I exported this. That's another reason why I like using SpeedTree with it. And there's that note I just mentioned there is for creating a color variation, which helps make the scene more realistic, because not everything's the same color. It's pretty basic, and I make sure that the shading is turned to two-sided foliage so that it reacts better. And then I'm also using a subsurface scattering map derived from the color map and then multiplied with just a constant node in Unreal. And to get that node, you just like right-click constant, and you just want to get the 3, or a single constant is fine rather than a triple. Now the next more complicated material is the ground material, how I'm tiling this. Again, this is simulating what we do at Naughty Dog. It's a little more complex to set up. I'm not going to go into the details on how it was made. There's tons of documentation out there on setting up these blend materials, but I'm going to quickly go over the map on how this was made. And it uses a combination of the height lerp node, and everything's kind of feeding into one master material here. The big thing that I have on here is the displacement and tessellation. I make sure that is turned on to PN triangles, and that just allows that displacement to work accurately. And I have a number there that helps dictate how high resolution that is. You can see with that off how flat it is, and when I turn that back on in the shader, it's very very nice to have that extra level of detail. And adaptive tessellation means that it tessellates more as the camera, the player, gets closer to it, and that helps with performance down the road. So there it is. You can kind of see how those details displace and add to the definition of the scene. This is basically on the website here from Epic, is what I use as a base, and I just took that and exaggerated a bit to get all the other channels and maps in there, but the premise is exactly the same. So I highly recommend going over the documentation here, because it's pretty much exactly what I used. Now, I didn't use 3 materials, I only used 2, but I could have used 3. I just wanted to keep it a little more simple in this case, but you could totally use 3, and that's based on the RGB values and using the vertex color node to separate that out. So with that in mind, I'm using that same approach on the documentation on this shader, and just using the vertex color and the height lerp to blend between the various rock textures into one shader. And I have a few constant nodes again here controlling how high the sand is versus how high the rocks are. That just allows me to balance out the height of each of those. So this is how I create most of the nodes. Just right click, start typing in the name of the node, and then it drops in. Rename it properly to what I want that descriptor to be, and start plugging in and going through. Now I use a lot of multiply, a lot of constant. Those are the two main ones that I seem to, in most of these shaders tend to be used heavily. But yeah, this is kind of just the way I get the nodes in there. It's a really quick way. Rather, you could also use the right tab over there and search, but I find the right click, type in to be pretty quick. Yep, and just going over, actually that's one I did not use, so I'm deleting that. And they all come into one, and that's ready to be painted on the surface. So now I'm going to be looking at this sculpted rock, and if I look at the reference, you'll see that there's a lot of dirt buildup on the top from rocks that fell and broke down on top of each other. So what I want to do is create a shader that I created here that basically acts like a slope shader in 3CO Max or in Maya, and it only responds and adds that shader looking down on the top surface of that. So it simulates snow, or in this case, built up rocks. But when I rotate that rock, you see that no matter what, whenever it's facing up, only that shader is applied. And in this case, I'm using an override shader just to drop it on top so that I can just pick and choose which rocks have this, because I don't want all rocks to have this. I just want just a few, maybe the one that is getting too busy, and this helps calm things down a bit on the surface. It helps integrate the sand a bit on